Over the span of your entire online history, you've probably visited websites with this cool looking animation. These animations are called a marquee, and all it is elements laid out horizontally and that scroll infinitely. On the surface, this seems like a pretty simple animation. However, if you've ever tried to build this yourself, then you know that it's deceptively difficult, or at least difficult enough that you felt the need to use JavaScript. And actually, most tutorials you'll find on YouTube and on the web in general about this animation has you using JavaScript. However, in this video, we're going to be building it with CSS only. So no JavaScript, only CSS. Now let's take a look at what we're going to be building. This is what we're building. It's the horizontal infinite scroll animation, and for the purposes of this video, I'm animating rectangle divs. However, this will work with whatever element you want. And now before we start, let's first visually go over how we're going to pull off this animation step by step with CSS only. First, we're going to need some divs. Then, we're going to use a position of absolute to remove our divs from the normal flow of the document. Doing so resulted in all of our divs stacking up on top of one another. Then, what we do is we position all of our divs to the right outside of the wrapper. Now we create our animation, a very simple one. All our animation does is moves all of our divs to the left. And of course we loop it so that it animates infinitely. Now everything so far was pretty straightforward, but this is where the magic happens. Currently, all of our divs are animating at the same time. They're all stacked up on top of each other and they're all moving to the left at the same time. This is obviously not what we want, so what we can do is give each individual div a different delay. We tell each individual div to start its animation after a different delay. And when we do, this creates a staggered effect where each item starts its animation at a different time. With each div having its own delay before starting its animation, it's almost like our divs are all in line, waiting for their turn to move. This is how our animation is going to work under the hood, and in the end, this is going to be the end result. In the description of this video, you'll find a link to a CodePen where you can check out the final result for yourself. And there's also going to be a link to a second CodePen with the exact same animation, but with two rows going in different directions, similar to the thumbnail of this video. To get started, all I have is an index.html with an empty body element, a styles.css with two rule sets, and then back in my index.html, we see I'm already importing my styles.css file. Inside my empty body element, I'll add a div with a class called wrapper, and inside of it, I'll add 8 div elements. These 8 div elements are going to be our rectangles, and it doesn't have to be 8, it can be any amount you want, but in this video, we're going to have 8 rectangles. I'll give each one of them a class called item, and item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. This is literally all we need for our HTML. Looking at our live server, we see nothing is being displayed, and this is because our divs are all empty. So in my CSS, I'll select our items by their class name of item, and I'll give them a width of 200 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, a background color of red, and a border radius of 6 pixels. When I save and look at my live server, we see our rectangles are being displayed. Back in my CSS, I'll select a wrapper by its class name of wrapper, and I'll give it a border of 1 pixel, solid black. When I save and look at my live server, we see our black border. However, our wrapper is touching the edges of the viewport. So back in my CSS, I'll give our wrapper a width of 90%, a max width of 1530 pixels, and a margin inline of auto. Looking at our live server, we see this looks a lot better. Earlier, I outlined step by step how we're going to build our animation. The first step was adding our divs, which we already did. We added 8 div elements. The second step was removing our divs from the normal flow of the document with a position of absolute. So in my CSS, I'll give our items a position of absolute. And we also need to give our wrapper a position of relative so that the positioning of absolute on our items can be relative to the wrapper. If you don't understand this, I have a whole video about CSS positioning on my channel. looking at our live server, we see our divs are now all stacked up on top of each other. This is what we want. However, with our divs now having a position of absolute, our wrapper loses its height. So back in my CSS, I'll give my wrapper a height equal to the height of our items, so a height of 100 pixels. While I'm here, I'll also give my wrapper a margin top of 5 rem. And this is just to add some space between the wrapper and the top of the viewport. So now we've added our divs and we removed them from the document. The next thing we need to do is position our divs outside of the wrapper. So in my CSS, I'll give my items the left property. I want to position our divs exactly here, outside of the wrapper and to its right. This is very important. It needs to be outside of the wrapper, and I'm choosing the right side because that's where I want my animation to start. So to position our divs outside of the wrapper on its right side, I'll set the left property to 100%. When I save, we see our divs are now outside of the wrapper and on the right, exactly where we want them to be. The next thing we need to do is create our animation. However, before we create it, it's important to understand that where our divs are currently located is exactly where we want our animation to start. However, we also need to know where we want our divs to be when the animation ends. Our animation starts outside of the wrapper on its right. So logically, we want our animation to end outside of the wrapper on its left. Now that we've established where we want our animation to start and where we want our animation to end, I'll create a keyframe called scroll left. And inside the curly braces, we can define where our animation starts and where our animation ends. I'll add from curly braces and to curly braces. From represents the beginning of the animation and to represents the end of the animation. The only one we care about defining is the end of the animation. We don't need to define the beginning of the animation because our divs are already exactly where we want them to start. If our divs are already positioned where we want the animation to start, then we don't need to define where they start in our keyframe, so I'll remove from and its curly braces. I'll open up the curly braces of to, and what we need to do is define where we want our divs to be positioned when the animation ends. We said we wanted our divs to end outside of the wrapper and on its left, so I'll add the left property and I'll set it to -200 pixels because 200 pixels is the width of our boxes, so we say -200 pixels. In case you're confused about why we set it to -200, I'll demonstrate. On my item role set, we see a left of 100% positions our divs to the right of our wrapper. However, if I replace it with 0 and save, we see our divs are now positioned at the beginning of the wrapper. Now when I set it to -200 pixels, we see it positions our divs outside of the wrapper to its left. This is also why it was important to define a position of relative on the wrapper, otherwise these values wouldn't be relative to the wrapper. I'll undo my changes, and now that we have our keyframe on my item rule set, we need to define the animation properties. I'll give it the animation name property, and I'll set it to the name of our keyframe, so scroll left. I'll add the animation duration property, and I'll set it to 3 seconds. I'll add the animation timing function property, and I'll set it to linear. And finally, I'll add the animation iteration count property, and I'll set it to infinite. When I save and look at our live server, we see we have our animation. Our animation starts outside of the wrapper from its right, it ends outside of the wrapper from its left, and of course, it runs infinitely. Our animation works exactly as intended. However, we don't actually want to see our divs when they're outside of the wrapper. We only want them to appear once they enter the wrapper, and to do this is very simple. In my CSS, on my wrapper rule set, I'll give it an overflow of hidden. When I save and look at my live server, we see now our divs only appear when they're inside of the wrapper. This is another reason why we need a position of relative on our wrapper. Without it, our overflow of hidden would not be hiding our divs with the position of absolute. Now this next part is where the magic happens. Currently, our animation is being applied on all our divs, which are all stacked up on top of each other. This is obviously not what we want. We want our divs to animate sequentially, and this is done by delaying the animation with a unique animation delay on each one of our divs. When each individual div has its own unique animation delay, it creates a staggered effect where each div starts its animation at a different time. Now, hopefully, this is easy to understand. I'm hoping at this point, everyone sees how giving a different delay to each one of our divs would create a sequential animation. However, the actual implementation of this concept is admittedly complicated because it requires mathematics. So in my CSS, we want to give each individual div its own unique animation delay. To do this, I'll head over to my index.html, and we see we gave each div a class called item1, item2, item3, and so on. So back in my CSS, I'll select our first div by its class name of item1, and I'll give it the animation delay property. Before going any further, our animation is going way too fast. So on my animation duration property, I'll change it from 3 seconds to 30 seconds. When I save and look at my live server, we see this looks a lot better. Back in my CSS, because I want to give each div its own unique animation delay, I need to select all of them. So I'll copy our item1 rule set and I'll paste it 7 more times because we have 8 divs in total. Now I need to rename each rule set. This one is item2, item3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Back in my item1 rule set, for our animation delay, again, we're going to use mathematics. What I'm going to do is I'll write out the math first, explaining as I go, and then after it's all written, I'll explain further. So to do mathematics in CSS, we use the calc notation, and inside the parentheses, we can do math. The first thing I want is our animation duration divided by our total number of divs. Our animation duration is 30 seconds and our total number of divs is 8. So I'll write 30 seconds divided by 8. Then I'll do times 8 minus 1 and I'll wrap both of these inside parentheses. 8 is again our total number of divs and we're subtracting 1 because this is item 1. Finally, the last thing we need to do is times minus 1. Now, I know this is probably confusing and I'll explain it in a second, but before I do, I'll copy my entire calc function and I'll paste it on all of the remaining empty animation delay properties. On item 2, I'll change 1 to 2. Then on item 3, I'll change 1 to 3. Item 4, 1 to 4. Item 5, 1 to 5, 6, 7, and 8. When I save and look at my live server, we see it worked. We have our marquee animation. Now back in my CSS, I need to better explain how this works. This entire calculation can be simplified as the duration of the animation relative to the total number of items times the unique delay for each item times minus 1, which just transforms the result into a negative number. 30 seconds divided by 8 determines how long each item's movement should take during the animation. Since there are 8 items, each item should take 1/8 of the total animation duration. This calculation ensures that each item moves at a consistent speed and covers the entire distance from right to left within the total animation duration. When you're writing this yourself, you need to make sure that you're using the same number of seconds as the number of seconds you defined in your animation duration property. They both have to be the same. And then 8 here is our total number of items. So if you have more or less than 8, it needs to match your total number of items. 8 minus 1 calculates the unique delay for item 1. Since item 1 is our first item, we say 8 minus 1. However, on item 2, we say that the delay is 8 minus 2, and so on. The 8 here is again our total number of items. If you have more or less, it needs to match your total number of items. Finally, we have times minus 1. All this does is converts the result of our calculation into a negative number. So whatever the result is of our calculation, doing times minus 1 at the end converts the result into a negative number. Now, to understand why we want the result of our calculation to be a negative number, we need to see how the animation delay property interacts with negative numbers. So to demonstrate, I'll comment out all of our individual items, and when I save, we see our divs are back to being stacked up on top of each other. On my item role set, I'll add an animation delay property, and I'll set it to a negative number. I'll set it to half of our animation duration, so 15 seconds, and I'll also make it a negative number. When I save and look at my live server, we see our div started their animation in the middle of the screen. When I set it to minus 25 seconds, we see now it started the animation towards the end. And finally, if I set it to minus 10 seconds, we see it started the animation towards the start. When you use a negative number on an animation delay, two things happen. First, instead of a delay, the animation plays instantaneously, as if we had given it 0 delay. And second, a negative number can control where the animation starts. We want our animation to go from right to left, and the starting point of our animation is completely to the right, outside of our wrapper. And so if we don't convert our result into a negative number, our marquee will start from the right, and it'll take a whole 30 seconds to cover the entire wrapper. I'll undo my changes. And just to demonstrate what would happen if we didn't have the times minus 1, I'll select it on each calculation and remove it. When I save and look at my live server, we see our animation starts from the right and slowly makes its way to the left. Now back in my CSS, I'll bring back the times minus 1. And when I save and look at my live server, we see instead of starting from the right and slowly making its way to the left, our animation has already started and already covers the entire wrapper. Now, while I'm here looking at my animation, we see our divs are entering the wrapper from the right and they're also disappearing on the left. This is what we want. However, it would look a lot better if they were to fade in from the right and fade away from the left. To do this is very simple. Back in my CSS, on my wrapper rule set, I'll add the mask image property. Now, if you don't know what the mask image property is, all it does is it hides part of an element it is applied to. So for example, imagine you had two images. The first image is a landscape and the second image is a star. Then you make the first image a background image to an element, and for the second image, you assign it as a value to the mask image property. When I do, we see our second image, which was assigned to the mask image property, masked our background image, and this is because the mask image property hides part of an element it is applied to. Now that you understand how the mask image property works, we can use it to create our fade out effect. However, instead of using an image, we're going to use a linear gradient. On my mask image property, I'll set it to the linear gradient function, and for the first argument, I'll set it to right. This indicates that our gradient should be horizontal. Then I'll define 4 RGBA functions. The first will be 0000, the second will be 0001, and 20% gradient transparency. These first two RGBA functions define the gradient for the left side. The last two RGBA functions define the gradient for the right side. I'll set the third RGBA function to 0001 and 80% gradient transparency, and I'll set the last RGBA function to 0000. I'll also remove the border from our wrapper. We don't need it anymore. When I save and look at my live server, we see this looks perfect. However, there's one last thing we need to do. Our animation isn't actually responsive, and we can see this when I resize the page. We see, as I resize the page, the gaps between each div get smaller and smaller until eventually they're all touching each other. The reason this is happening is because if we look at our CSS on our left property, we see I'm using a percentage for my value. When I resize the page, 100% changes relative to the width of the viewport, and this constantly changes as I resize the page. So what we need to do is use a pixel value. For our pixel value, I want the width of our divs times the total number of divs in our animation. I'll replace 100% for the calc notation, and inside the parentheses, I'll say 200 pixels times 8. This equals 1600 pixels. When I save and look at my live server, we see this fixed our problem. When I keep resizing the page down, we see our animation stays responsive. However, before I resize the page up to full screen, in my CSS, on my wrapper rule set, I'll comment out the width and the max width properties. Back on my live server, I'll resize the page up to full screen, and we see our animation is responsive on small to medium screens. However, when we reach full screen, our animation doesn't animate all the way to the right. We see there's always a big gap on the right side of the page, and we also see our divs appearing, which isn't something we want. So our new left property is only responsive for smaller screens, and our old left property of 100% was only responsive for larger screens. How do we fix this? Well, we could use a media query that checks the width of the viewport and changes the value of our left property accordingly. However, there's an even better solution. Back in my CSS, on my left property, I'll wrap the calc function inside the max function. Our calc function is now the first argument to the max function, and I want to give it a second argument. So I'll add a comma, and for our second argument, I'll say 100%. If you're not familiar with the max function, all it does is it applies the biggest argument at any given time. We're giving it 2 arguments, and so whichever one out of these 2 arguments happens to be the biggest is the one that's going to be applied. Our first argument is 200 pixels times 8. This results in 1600 pixels, and it'll always be 1600 pixels. However, our second argument is a percentage. Whenever I resize the page, this changes the width of our wrapper. When the page is full screen, the wrapper is wider than 1600 pixels, and so our max function applies our second argument. However, when we resize the page down to smaller viewports, 100% becomes smaller than our first argument. And when that happens, our first argument is what gets applied. So let's see if this worked. On my live server, we see on full screen, our animation looks perfect. And when I resize the page down, we see our animation still looks perfect. This means using the max function fixed our problem. And now our animation is fully responsive without the need of any media queries. Back in my CSS, on my wrapper rule set, I'll bring back the width and max width property. When I save and look at my live server, we see our animation is finished. This CSS video was a little more advanced. However, it's surprising how powerful CSS is and what it can accomplish, especially considering the fact that typically this animation is built with JavaScript. I think this CSS-only solution is cleaner. If you enjoyed this video, consider giving it a like, subscribe, and thanks for watching.